Hi everyone, welcome and thank you for joining our session this morning. I'm Cheryl Wang, a sophomore student at Cornell majoring in landscape architecture, and I will be your MC. If you have any questions for today's speakers, please use the Zoom Q&A feature and we will take the questions at the end if there's time. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor, the Illinois Institute of Technology College of Architecture, for sponsoring our talk today. Their landscape architecture plus urbanism program is a fundamentally progressive urban enterprise based on three defining principles: the equitable global growth of our urban centers, robust transdisciplinary collaboration, and the advancement of urban landscape theory in research and in practice. As the only accredited landscape architecture program in Chicago, they are uniquely positioned to confront these challenges. Their degree program include B.Arch, M.Arch, MS.Arch, MLA+U, and PhD. Now I'm excited to introduce our two speakers. During his almost 20-year career working in the profession of landscape architecture, Derek has been filled by global project experiences and a goal to blend the intrinsic qualities of a site with essential design elements that frame rich narrative and elevate the user experience. The cultural influence of a project's place informed the story that Derek works to express in his work. Prioritizing functionality and craftsmanship, his diverse portfolio represents destinations that serves as nodes for social, cultural, ecological enrichment for our own project ranging from urban design work, mixed-use developments, and a multitude of hospitality projects. Derek has a BLA from the University of Guelph, has taught at UCLA's landscape architecture program, and has been invited to speak at ASLA's national conference, LABash, World City Festivals, has been published in Architectural Digest, The Hill, and is a leader of EDSA's New York studio. Wong is a landscape designer for EDSA. A firm specializes in landscape architecture, planning, and urban design. She earned a dual degree from Cornell University, majoring in landscape architecture and urban regional studies. As a native New Yorker, Ivy has been interested in the built environment's abilities to promote connections and engagement between people and the environment. Her collegiate studio in social resiliencies and neighborhood scale sustainable design and her professional work in designing vibrant public realm spaces has fostered her interest in environmental responsibility. Today, they are presenting their talk titled Their Places. Welcome, Derek and Ivy.
Hi, everyone. Hello. We are coming to you from our studio in New York City. We're happy to be getting back into the office a lot more, but you are going to see us wearing our masks today. And we're really excited to be here, be part of LABash. It's a tradition that I was a part of as a student for many years, both hosting at Guelph as well as traveling around the country to attend them as a student. And it's so great to see that even 20 years later, they're still kind of going strong. So we're happy to be here, Ivy and myself, talking about third places. And to kind of get started before we even pull up any of the material we want to share, we wanted to open up the conversation and also start to get everyone thinking about some ideas that are going to obviously tie to what we're talking about today. So use the chat feature to kind of put some of your ideas into there. We can come back to them in the question period and see if they can help kind of generate more conversation around the topic. So what we want to ask is really looking at and thinking about where were the places before COVID that we used to spend most of our time outside of home or work. So obviously if you're a student, school and work are the same thing essentially. So, outside of home and work, where did you find yourself spending time in your daily life before COVID? And then also think about how that changed over the last year. What was that place for you that you felt like you belonged the most, that you enjoyed going to the most? And just kind of take note of those, maybe share those two places in the chat, and we can come back to that as we wrap up the presentation. So from there, we'll go into sharing some of the slides that we've prepared and talking through what we feel is a topic that for landscape architects has been extremely relevant and important throughout the years and throughout the profession, but has obviously garnered a lot more attention and a lot more kind of relevance in the last year and what we've been through as a country and globally as a pandemic kind of took hold of the world. So we're going to be presenting this idea of celebrating urban culture and innovation through the design of third places. So the term third places, we'll get into a little bit more on what that is, but I think what we want to kind of focus on first is what are Ivy and I's third places, right? We both live in New York City. We are both landscape architects. I think that there's a lot that we value in our everyday lives and a lot that's kind of been reframed in our everyday lives throughout the last year. So as we get into this, we just wanted to share a couple of these images of places that have really become our third place before we even go into defining the kind of technical term of what a third place is. So on the left of the screen, you'll see two places for me, one being outdoor dining in the community I live in Brooklyn. This is Fort Greene coffee shop where they were, really every business was struggling within New York City and many urban centers around the country to kind of figure out how they could continue business through this pandemic. Seasonally, culturally, everything had to be considered as they were shifting to obviously not allowing to have indoor space. So this idea of supporting local business, having places to still get out and eat safely at, get takeout from, those became a lot of frequented places for my family and I. And then the next picture over is Herbert von King Park. This is a small community park in my neighborhood where I live in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. It's actually Frederick Law Olmsted designed and obviously has went through a lot of transitions over the years. But this park, which we had obviously taken for granted in the first few years of living one block from it, became really a sanctuary, a real getaway for us and the whole community. Outdoor gyms took up space here. Dog walkers obviously frequented, families. It really became the hub of the community where everybody could still feel safe. And I think one last point is just that on a very personal note, my wife and I became parents during COVID. We had a baby in August, and that kind of complexity of everything and looking at third places and public space was done through a completely different lens for us for the first time. And I think it really will influence a lot on how I work and how I design professionally.
And similar to Derek's point, pre-COVID, I found my third place to be in the city. I would always go to Central Park. I would go to the High Line. I would go to Domino Park and all these parks that were, far away. They took a trek to go to, but they were always enjoyable and an experience to get to. But during COVID, because we were so limited to our local area, public transportation was off limits. I really learned the value of embracing my local park, which is called Raymond O'Connor, and it's in the picture in the top right. And I did not even know this park existed until after COVID. And I found myself going here almost every single day to take a walk, to meet up with friends in a socially distanced manner. And it became, our go-to place, like, let's meet at the park. That's what all of our friends would say. And even in that picture with the little bubbles, I thought it was very creative how people started to convert all these streets that were previously all vehicular into outdoor dining spaces. And I feel like the US or New York is it's slow to follow many European and many Asian countries and setting up these exterior spaces. So I definitely really appreciated that. And it was one way, because I love food and I love going to restaurants, that was one way for us to still have that sort of experience without necessarily feeling unsafe because we were indoors.
Yeah, perfect. So from there, we want to go into a little bit about defining third places. I think at a more general level, not necessarily talking about landscape architecture just yet, but What a third place is kind of what we outlined when we asked to kind of get feedback in the comments, but you have two places. You have a place of home, which is where you live, sleep, and relate to your family. You also then have this outside place, which most of us had prior to COVID, where it was your work or your school, the place where you earn money and relate to colleagues or fellow students. The third place is really the place that you would go to spend time, relax, enjoy company. And I think really one of the things in that description that is really kind of sticks in mind the most is a place where you feel like you belong, right? So that may be a community place, a place of worship, a place of gathering, a community center. It doesn't have to be an outdoor place, even though COVID kind of shed a lot more light on outdoor places because of safety concerns. So a third place is really a place that lends balance to our lives. It allows us to be social creatures like we are. And really the form of what a third place might be can be as informal as public park gatherings, which we've talked about, or it could be going to church at the same time every Sunday. So I think that the idea of third place to us was very intriguing. It's not something that we invented, and we want to make sure that we make that clear. So to expand on that idea a little bit more, we can look at this kind of sociologist definition of what is a third place. So we've done a lot of reading. Ray Oldenburg is somebody who has studied this for many years. I think the term was kind of coined in the 90s and early 2000s is when he started writing about this more and more. And it's really the same way that we've been looking at it. It's places in our lives, in our daily lives, that we're able to go to on a regular basis. They may offer pleasure, they may offer escape, but what they are is they're alternatives to the lives we lead in our homes, in our work, on our phones, and all the technology that we're now kind of bombarded with. Through COVID, we've obviously all just become so dependent on that, whether it's working from home, remote school. A lot of things are just really making that hard to escape. So the idea of the third place has become so much more important to us. The second kind of quote or body of text on this page also talks about the fact that this was happening before COVID occurred. And what was really slowly happening in society is that brick and mortar establishments where we would find places to go have obviously been on the decline, mostly with retail, as online retail comes and takes a hold of the world. But also a lot of things becoming more and more remote. And as that becomes the norm or the trend on a worldwide level, it makes places for social interactions in our daily lives much more important. And I think that the ripple effect from that is something that we're not going to be able to deny, that is really going to take a hold of our profession and only become more and more of a driver for why we do the work that we do as landscape architects and planners. We wanted to share this. We saw this idea of a sphere of influence, and I think that there's kind of two ways to look at this sphere of influence and what this really means. One is to look at it personally in like how you want to affect change or impact in your daily life, whether that's through the relationships you form, the places you go, the time you spend with others in your community. And then there's also looking at it in the professional form of us being landscape architects, planners, architects, or any of those professions, in how we look at public space and value. So, you know, obviously starting at that personal core and those relationships and that ripple effect of family, community, campus, the greater of society, the greater of culture, and then the greater of the global good in what we do as a profession. I think this is why our profession is one of the most exciting in the world, is that we can affect change on a lot of scales. And I think that what Ivy and I really get excited about in this conversation is that we can talk about this on a very personal level as we started the presentation, but what you'll see as we go through this series of slides and the work we describe, it is also looking at how our work is done on a global scale. And it's not just for us, we're lucky at EDSA that we can affect change globally as well as in our community. And that's what we want to kind of highlight today.
When it comes to third places, they are the essential building blocks of a community. Some even call them the living room of society. They're intended to be leveling places that place no importance on an individual's role in society. They're intended and described as a home away from home. They're open and accessible to their users. Most of these places are physical, with the exception of virtual chat rooms and online communities, and with the advent of COVID, digital communication services such as Zoom. But regardless of that fact, because most third places are physical, that's where the overlap between third places and public spaces come in. In a study, a pair of researchers from the Ulsan Institute of Science and Technology in Korea categorized all the different types of public spaces within an urban environment into 4 quadrants: the dynamic, pragmatic, static, and enjoyment. And these are related to the characteristics and experiences of moods within that space. And what the study actually showed was that these spaces that fell within the dynamic and enjoyment received the highest ratings for freedom of expression, perceived safety, and freedom from judgment based off of the participants' perceived experience within that space. And when you start to look at the spaces within that category, you'll start to realize that most of these are exterior. They include squares, parks, and playgrounds, and that's where we as landscape architects can make the most dramatic impacts in shaping these third spaces of individuals. Therefore, there's an implication that the public space can do more than just provide a physical space for people to gather. And it is even more important for landscape architects to not only consider the physical factors, but social factors as well in our design of the space. We have the ability to create and shape a public space that can create a level playing ground for all of its users, regardless of background. And this diagram on the right demonstrates the characteristics or makeup of a public space. Its identity, which includes the history and context, the people, which includes the stakeholders and users, the uses within that space, and then the place, which refers to the physical characteristics. And one way that we can truly bring meaning to public space is placemaking.
Yeah, so with placemaking, I know that this is something that as landscape architects we're introduced to in college throughout our profession. It's something that we always go back to. We've taken this chart as a great example from peopleforpublicspace.org. Instead of recreating this, I think that there is so much information in this that we reference on a regular basis that we just wanted to use this diagram. But to really understand this kind of leap now, right, from understanding what third places can be, making that connection to them often being public space that is highly valued in society, and now the steps that we use as we go into design in placemaking. So placemaking is, definition-wise, a multifaceted approach to planning, design, and management of public spaces. It really looks to a community's assets, inspiration, and potential, and it wants to promote people's health, happiness, and well-being. And as you start to look at this diagram in the middle loop of words, you really start to see a lot of the things that are talk to comfort and feeling and, making sure that every space we do is accessible. So there's a lot of things here that really drive society and show how we can have influence on them. The other things that we want to make sure is that as we start to refocus design on what has traditionally been landscape architecture projects in cities and urban environments, we look at parks that moved towards not being over-programmed. How do we design a park that can have recreation built in without recreation being the only use, right? We saw during COVID so many parks in New York City that are designed as fenced-in baseball fields, only being used for baseball once a week if it was still happening. Meanwhile, that entire large open green space could have been used for people to have picnics or sit on or play with their children. So I think what we want to do as this kind of realization takes a hold is look at the characteristics and the principles of design and how they can help drive the design of parks, the design of streets, and how sidewalks can become a usable space in our daily lives rather than just being a linear place where we go from A to B. So from placemaking, we want to expand on how this can really affect change in our work and how it can help us be a driving change behind the designs we do.
So since we both live in New York, we've personally witnessed examples of placemaking efforts by the city to return public space to its residents. And to what Derek was speaking about earlier in sidewalks, some of you may be familiar with the Open Streets Initiative, which is basically prioritizing the pedestrian by blocking out sections of the roads in New York City. And in a city where we're already so limited on public space, this helps to return space to the residents while also supporting small businesses and community building activities, because essentially what you have is a large open space where you could pretty much do anything. Another thing that we've noticed has been very beneficial to placemaking is the public-private partnerships, which are basically nonprofit organizations that are comprised of community stakeholders, including owners, businesses, and local leaders. And the benefits of a PPP is that they can leverage the funding of corporations to fund public space operations and maintenance. And often we find that money goes in to the front end to build it, but because there's a lack of funding from the operations and maintenance perspective, that can cause the feasibility and the success of a project to deteriorate. And I think this connects back to the broken windows theory, which if you're an urban planner, you'll be aware of, which is the fact that the visible appearance of a place is connected with the perceived safety and disorder of a place. So we listed some of these partnerships, and they are private organizations that fund just the maintenance of these specific districts and even the creation of public space so that they can ensure that the overall, it kind of benefits both the public and the private to invest into these zones.
Exactly.
And the image on the bottom right is actually a new project that's being built. And Derek, I know you have a little anecdote about it's designed by Heather Wick, but.
Yeah, Heather Wick and MNLA, I know Signe Nielsen spoke yesterday at the conference, is a great friend of ours, but this is a great example of one of these public-private partnerships that's opening imminently any time now, which the whole city is kind of invigorated by, excited about. I mean, it's similar to the High Line and the success that the High Line's brought to meatpacking in Chelsea. And as a New York resident, it's really incredible to see these projects change neighborhoods, change people's lives, and at the end of the day, give more open space to the residents of urban environments. So we're excited about all of these projects that are happening in the city. None that we're necessarily involved directly in, but this is also, as a studio in New York, we can learn so much from these as we take our experience out there onto domestic and global projects all over the world.
And now shifting gears a bit, when we as landscape architects design for public spaces, we start by understanding the context of the place. Some of our projects that we work on, the understanding portion of the process is much longer because of different factors. We could be working in a different region of the world that we're not familiar with, which we'll talk about later on in this presentation. Or it could also be that there are many social cultural factors going into the design of this project that need to be taken into consideration. And once we understand, we will then design and continue to refine this design through multiple iterations and with work review meetings with the stakeholders and clients. We must ask ourselves continually, is this project feasible, viable, or desirable? When designing for third spaces or public spaces, there's no way to predict how it will impact its surrounding context once built, but we must ensure that the different principles listed on the following page need to be carried out through the design vision.
Yeah, so when we start to look at these kind of design characteristics or design factors of the work we do, what we tried to do here is take those major items and kind of group them into 4 categories, because what it does is it gives us kind of a gut check when we're doing our work and when we're evaluating our work on how the success of a project is actually benefiting society. So we can look at these into 4 categories of social, cultural, environmental, and economical or economy. These different categories of change and impact that we can have, and this applies locally, globally, across all scales. But when we really look at a project from a social perspective, we're looking at making sure that it's inclusive, that it's accessible to all in the neighborhood, and that it's equitable. We at EDSA do a lot of work in the hospitality realm, and that realm for us is something that we're always trying to change and trying to push the boundaries on. You know, global vacationing, global hospitality uses are often very limited in access. But what we're seeing is that operators, hotel brands are all realizing the importance of public space within a hospitality property. So it's been exciting for us to see that change occur slowly over time, and that we can be on the cusp of making that happen. With cultural design factors, we look at tradition, the historical references, and the relevance of a project within where it is, the context of where it is. This might be for the people who live there, for the people who are traveling to it. But either way, what we want to do is be very sensitive to the cultural references that we're making within our work. Oftentimes, this is now done by having cultural experts on our teams to help inform us through research and through the practices that we perform. The environmental aspects of our design are kind of more obvious, I guess, because we are landscape architects, but looking at sustainability, resiliency, ensuring long-lasting spaces, not just sustainable environmentally, but sustainability in the materiality, and making sure that a project can stand the test of time for the environment that it's made. And then also enhancing the environmental attributes of a site that we can kind of have a huge influence on. When it comes to economy, it's not the funnest topic we want to talk about as landscape architects, but it's a reality, and it looks at, is a project being funded properly? Is it going to be a revenue generating project that will allow for operations and maintenance to be successful at the end of the day? So I think what we're trying to do as a global company is make sure that we are checking the boxes on all of these different factors as we go through the design process, the design evaluation, and then ultimately when we revisit a built project, that we can also revisit these different topics.
So we can go on to talking about some of the projects that we've worked on where there is a public space component. This first one is a concept for Governor's Island, and I don't know if some of you are familiar with it, but we worked with the Governor's Islands Trust and a marina development company to develop a master plan for future phases of development for the island. The island was actually purchased for 1 cent from its previous owner and has very much been a primarily public use island. And in order to find a way to generate revenue to support the public use portion of the island, we had a workshop with our client and the stakeholders where we brainstormed possible uses. And the result was a master plan that included museums, art galleries, food halls, flexible use festival grounds, and even a proposed tech campus with a communal open space. And this was an example of a plan that could be developed further using a public-private partnership that could provide additional public open space, but also would be beneficial to the stakeholders within this island so that there's a symbiotic relationship there.
Yeah, this was a really fun project to work on. And the most interesting thing about this is that obviously a lot of us know the central park space you're seeing here that's kind of grayed out exists, but all of these edge spaces are part of future phases of work. And you never know who your client's going to be. I mean, the client that we were working for that had connections to the Public Trust Fund here are actually yachting developers that have done a lot of work in the Caribbean and across the world. But what they realized is that this in New York can be a real hub of activity for getting people access to the water, getting people on the water, doing sailing schools, and really kind of opening up New York residents, opening up their eyes to kind of a whole new recreation that didn't exist here. But in order for them to bring that in, they also had to make sure that all the other support systems were there. When we talk about another project that we looked at, this one done by our Baltimore office down in Maryland, we look at seasonal programming. And I think what we're going to try to do on these projects is kind of highlight some of the special points of each one, not to necessarily give the whole design process on each one, but to really highlight. And this is a great example of a public civic square that had been neglected for years. You have government buildings on the left and right, and then some new mixed use that you're seeing in the background. But one of the strongest program drivers of this site was that it had to be functionally designed to perform through all 4 seasons, right? And rather than creating public spaces that look forced, you know, that we have to kind of redesign for every season, a lot of the design here was built in from day one through the public art, the public open space, the circulation, looking at all those factors that could make this park as successful in, you know, your summertime renderings that you always see, as opposed to, you know, what we all know here in the Northeast can be sometimes pretty long and harsh winters. So looking at enjoyment, I think that it's interesting, the diagram we were showing about the quadrants, when you really start to look at the places of enjoyment and what we can do in public space, a lot of that can fall to how we as landscape architects are programming our work.
So since our company is based mainly in Fort Lauderdale, we do a lot of work down there in Florida. And for someone like me who was born and raised in New York and going down to Florida for the first time, my eyes were opened and I realized that, you know, there are a lot of issues that they do have to deal with. And one thing I immediately noticed was that the neighborhood character varied drastically from one block to the next. You could be walking on the beach and there will be a bunch of storefronts, you have hotels and you feel like, you know, everything's normal. And then you walk one block within the beach and you could feel completely like you're in a different place. You can feel unsafe. There's it's not a very walkable environment and there's a lot of parking lots. And I think one thing that the local community, especially in Fort Lauderdale, is trying to do is to, in the same way that New York is doing, give back public space to its users. And by supplementing public space within a largely, you know, industrial or largely just hardscape space, giving it back to the user and providing green space, they're focusing on, you know, promoting revitalization. And this is just one of the projects that we worked on for the Las Olas corridor improvements. It's a part of a larger master plan to revitalize the waterfront at Las Olas Beach. And I think on the following page, you start to see, you know, we're moving towards this idea of flexible spaces, and we have this large event lawn or a flexible use lawn that can be used for anything, yoga classes, workout classes. It can be used for larger events, and we find that's actually quite successful among the local residents because they can sit anywhere along these steps while utilizing the middle as well.
I think one thing just to add to this project is this dynamic that you don't see in the renderings is that this is something that came about as a community initiative, right? The city planning was like, this used to be a parking lot. This whole site that you're seeing, almost everywhere that you're seeing in this site, all the way up to the buildings in the background to the beach on the right, was a hard blacktop parking lot that for years, for 30, 40 years since Fort Lauderdale had become a kind of spring break destination, was just a sea of cars. And through city initiatives and our team in Fort Lauderdale being able to attend community meetings and be there as a local design team, was able to help shift the whole program. So with this, the city bought an adjacent lot, built a parking structure that is, you know, 3 blocks away from the beach and not on the beach, allowing this land to be freed up to become a public open space. So again, a really great initiative where the city's taking notice of what needs to be fixed and involving the proper local design authorities and the local designers, which we were lucky enough to be included in, to really kind of express that for them.
And similar to the Fort Lauderdale Los Olas Boulevard, Pompano Beach is a little further north, and they are faced with the same issues. It's not a very pedestrian-friendly environment, and this is also one of the projects where we gave back to the pedestrian. We had bike lanes designated on this boulevard as opposed to on the road, where you have a lot of cars moving back and forth. We created plazas with water features, and this also part of this was a dune rehabilitation or dune enhancement project. So there was also an environmental component to it, but ultimately this is giving space back to the user and promoting just like walkability and connectivity in Florida.
Yeah, and similarly, this is Delray Beach restoration. This is a 1.5 mile stretch of beach, again, north of Fort Lauderdale, that for years had been neglected and kind of been battered by many of the storms in Fort Lauderdale. It was kind of always just neglected because it was intended to be a more recreational. You can see all these little catamarans on the beach. That's these little sails where people park them and they're rented, and it's very much not a place where the tourists are coming, but a much more localized point of access to the beach. And this 1.5 mile stretch was redesigned so that we could make sure that the local community felt like this was a place also of enjoyment for them. They could walk this promenade you see along the road edge on the bottom, but we were very concerned with limiting the amount of access points up over the dune. These ones that you're seeing were all rehabilitated, they already existed, and we were coming in with new planting and new measures of how that dune grading worked to kind of prevent erosion in the case of large storms that are oftentimes hitting the coast down in Florida. Moving into a more kind of urban realm, we look at this space called Lake Nona Town Center. This is moving up to Central Florida now, near Orlando, and looking at a couple things that are typical in mixed-use development. You know, you have here you have a mix of hotel, workplace, and retail F&B, right? So a lot of food and beverage, a lot of restaurants you're seeing kind of on these central courtyards. You're seeing a parking garage in the back, which is lined and framed with public art installation. It's a very kind of dynamic piece. And then you're seeing some of the kind of office buildings in the background on the upper left, and those are obviously not lit up here as it's probably a weeknight evening and people are out enjoying the space. But one of the things that was a focus for EDSA on this project was not only creating comfortable public realm spaces so that once somebody did park their car in the garage and move out into this space, they felt safe and they felt like they could navigate. This is just a small part of the project. So there are free bicycles that you can grab from the parking garage to bike around the site and dock. And then the other thing is the public art component. So the parking garage is faced with a mesh screen that's done by an artist who actually used to be an EDSA employee, who's now pretty much an internationally known artist. That is like a punched metal screen that's actually Morse code and has a lot of language about the community built into it. And then the cylindrical element on the corner is actually a digital screen that changes. So they actually, for 4th of July, they show fireworks on this digital vertical screen. Obviously here is more of a memorial example of space, but the intent is that this space completely changes for the time of year, and it's programmed to work with holidays and festivals and also the local community in mind. And another one before we leave the kind of Florida realm of work, Ivy and I have been tied to a lot of Florida projects over the years, whether it's being directly involved in design or being kind of consultants from with a New York lens, kind of helping our team in Fort Lauderdale look at these things. This is an interesting project. It's called Fat Village. It's in Fort Lauderdale. It's food and technology center of where a lot of food production had traditionally happened in Fort Lauderdale, but is moving now into more like culinary school and kind of the restaurant scene as that's kind of become more and more popular in South Florida. But one thing is that this project is in the design process. It took a long time for kind of zoning regulations to all kind of come together, but the opportune time of this being reviewed locally during COVID allowed for us to revisit some things like the width of sidewalks and public space when we all started to realize the importance of outdoor dining. In Florida, you have weather where that can happen. So we wanted to really capitalize on that. So we actually went back and started to carve out places at the ground level of a lot of architecture so that we could have open public space used for dining and these events. So this is kind of one positive impact that COVID's had on the design process that was kind of happening in real time for us.
So switching gears a bit, when I first started working as a full-time employee at EDSA, we were receiving an influx of requests for proposals for projects in the Middle East, and a majority were from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and a lot of us had not worked there before. And in order to create a design that was contextually appropriate, we really had to focus and expand this understand portion of the design process above. And for Derek, he traveled with a group of other landscape architects actually to KSA for a few days to actually live firsthand what their life is like. And he visited multiple cultural landmarks. And for me, how I understood was by doing a lot of research, whether that's reading papers or articles, or even conversing with a client or other workers or other landscape architects who have already worked in that region. And you'll see that there were a lot of interesting things that we found out, and I like to highlight some of those because they were kind of very different from how I had been understanding my experience of public space. And at least within the Middle East, there's definitely a trend in the development and a shift towards focus on tourism as opposed to having most of their income come from oil. They realize that they can't depend on that anymore, and that's why there's a lot of investment going into these tourism projects. And there's actually growing westernization. Even though they are largely cultural, their culture and their politics are very tied, there seems to be a growing desire to veer away from that and, increasing liberalism. And that also played a very important role in how we understand how we design those projects. And for public space in Saudi, it's actually very scarce. Because they're in the middle of a desert, there are a lot of challenges that they have to deal with, including water as a precious resource. It's also, their culture is very tied to how they experience public space. They love to have tea in the afternoon with their dates. It's also very common for families to, when they're driving down the highway, to pull aside and just set up a picnic. Whereas, for most of us, like in the US, I'm sure we would never ever do that. But for them, it's completely normal because they don't need a designated space. They just make use of what they have because they are so limited. And it's also very hot, and you don't want to be out there in the middle of the day in the scorching heat. So we also had to come up with innovative solutions on how to make this a more comfortable space for them and to provide a refuge outside of just staying indoors all day. And some of these following projects are, these are some renderings that we've done, and these are public, like we were working on kind of like a highway development, but there's also a public space component to it. And you'll see that we're showing nighttime renderings because a lot of the program is intended to come alive at night. And that's why we need to think about how we build lighting effects into some of our structures. These umbrella shaped structures were also, they came as a result of us trying to figure out how we collect stormwater. In this region, it's very arid. They rarely have any rainfall, but when they do have rainfall, it's these huge deluges of rain, and there's a lot of flooding that comes as a result. So these pavilions act to capture stormwater on a smaller scale. And if you look at the blue wall in the background, it's actually a part of a larger channel that channels most of the larger, I guess, volume of water that flows in from most of these rain events. So another thing that our client really emphasized in the design process was the idea of placemaking and creating a sense of identity through site elements. And their culture is something that they really like to embrace. And they wanted every design element, whether it's a road sign or a pavilion or furniture, to be a part of a toolkit that represented the identity of the development. So the client also wanted it to be very much inspired by the site. So we referenced the culture, the history, and the place. And you can see in some of the pictures on the bottom, you know, the desert roads on the left, the palm trees, the wadis, and some of the cliff geomorphology that you find naturally in the site. And we used it and derived built elements from it, and we, you know, assembled them together in some of the renderings to show how that would all come together to create this sense of place for this development in particular.
I mean, I think one thing to note on this project, this is an ongoing project, and just to go back to this slide, these images you're seeing of the cliffs on the bottom right, that's our actual site. That is a 200-meter tall cliff that splits our site in half. If this was a site in the US, this would be a national park, most likely. I mean, this is of the scale of kind of Grand Canyon and some of these really amazing elements. So what's happening is that the site's being developed, it's a massive site, and there's portions where we need to focus the urban comfortability, right? And that's where these toolkits can really come in to help, because the massive scale of this is so beyond a human scale. But when you come into these spaces that start to show up in these corridors and in these connections and in the city center, the scale of bringing all that back down to something relatable is extremely important to the process. And we've had a lot of fun playing with everything from the signage and the lighting and the seating to bring it all together into an identity that's unique to this place in the world.
Another project that we worked on, this is called King Salman Park, and it was part of a competition to create the green heart of Riyadh, as it is located within the center of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And it's actually, it used to be an airport grounds, but now currently it's a little bit desolate. They're trying to turn it into a green space. And similar to the other projects that we've worked on in this region, there are a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration. And when we do have this brief, the client always asks us to consider, how can we make the pedestrian and user more comfortable in this space? How do we really make use of water as a precious resource, and how do we conserve it? How do we collect it? And also, how do we push the boundaries of technology and, you know, remove the idea of vehicles and promote walkability, cycling, and even autonomous vehicles, so that it becomes really focused on the pedestrian and on the user. And I think this project was really exciting for me because we hired a lot of consultants, like environmental engineers, a cultural consultant, and thermal comfort consultants who we work with now very frequently because we do a lot of work in this region. And often, you know, landscape architects, we're not scientists, so it's very hard to back up our project with numbers. But when we had these engineers come on, they actually turned this more into something that could be a reality, even though it was so visionary from our perspective.
Yeah, this was a fun one. I mean, one of the major concepts here was that generally breezes and open air in the desert are really kind of comforting. And then we also looked at playing to the idea of astrology and making this place, since everyone uses these parks in the evening, elevating people up, which you can see on this like sky bridge, so that it can really be kind of like a stargazing point to kind of understand your place in the world. It's kind of fun. idea culturally, since a lot of desert communities are settled based on people going on these treks through the desert and only having the sky to lead them. So that's kind of some of the deeper discussions we had on the conversation here. And we're going to end really quick and then have a few minutes for questions. But before we do that, we just want to touch on two projects, built projects in Dubai. EDSA had started working in Dubai 25, 30 years ago when it was really becoming this kind of new urban center of business and economy in the world. So it's funny now because a lot of the projects that EDSA has done over the years in Dubai are kind of the most established examples of public space. A couple of those being Medina Jumeirah and a few others that have really kind of formed culturally significant spaces for locals, but also really contributed to the tourism scene. One of the newer places that's been done in recent years is this one that you're seeing, Blue Waters. So building the largest Ferris wheel in the world has become a kind of attraction to so many cities for some reason. And here you're seeing it over to the right, but really Blue Waters is an island that is mixed use development. And again, what we really focused on here is it being an entertainment space for locals as much as it is tourists, so that, you know, in times like COVID, when you have a massive population in the United Arab Emirates who are no longer traveling and using their expendable money to go on vacation, they can actually be here and use this space. And it's become actually more popular during the last year than it ever was before. So it's really kind of great to see places like that having such success. And this one is what we'll end on. This is the Dubai Opera House that we had built 6 years ago now. In the downtown core of Dubai. The Burj Khalifa is just to the right, which is the tallest building in the world. So a lot of attention on this site, just because it is the place where fireworks are watched on New Year's and all these kind of events happen. But the most important element about this space is that culturally, this is one of the most significant and first public spaces where the UAE could celebrate their own culture. So operas, events, all of these things on a global scale, but also on a domestic, like national scale for the United Arab Emirates are celebrated here. And what it means is that all of those celebrations from inside the opera house, which is shaped and themed after one of their traditional boats that they have over there called the Dhow. All of these events flow out into the landscape. So whether it's on these softscape terraces or on the reverse side in this image is a giant plaza where everyone's kind of arriving on red carpet for events at the cultural center. So it's really all about the flow of the indoor, the outdoor celebration of their national day and flag day. Everything kind of happens here for the city. And it's really been an exciting project to kind of see evolve and grow over the years. So with that, we kind of, we wrap up going from a very personal level to a very global level in our design process. And we'd love to kind of revisit the question. I don't know if there's anything in the chat about people sharing their ideas on what was there. Now that we've kind of outlined what they are, what is your third place, or what does that third place become for you over the last year?
Yes, there are two. I will just quickly shout out to people's their third places. For Diana Borick, her third places are trains, train stations, plaza, and sidewalks. And for Alexis Kellner, her third places is a local coffee shop, and it switched to picking up coffee and sitting in a nearby park.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that's obviously been a real trend, is that, you know, that third place for anybody prior to COVID was, you know, could have been easily an indoor or outdoor space, but when health concerns come into play, it forced a lot of people outside.
Yeah, totally. And I guess we have time for more Q&A questions. The first question we have is, how does EDSA confront or consider gentrification in your projects? These projects are interesting and beautiful and have positive impacts on the economy of neighborhoods, but that often means pushing out low-income or minority community members.
You want to go?
I need to think about this a little bit.
So I think that a lot of times in public work, which is obviously most of what you see that we work on, has a private partnership involved, right? A lot of our hospitality work is obviously private development. Some of the projects we were talking about, like Las Olas Corridor, that's obviously a community initiative. That's a public driven project. So what we need to be doing when we do our work is it's oftentimes paying close attention to what our client wants, right? On projects where gentrification and the information for that is available, we're going to pay attention to it, and we're going to have that conversation throughout the design process, because so like going back to the 4 factors of social, cultural, environment, and economy, we weigh those evenly. We know that not every project has the exact same significance on all 4 of those that it's not placed from the outset. And I think that is why landscape architects play such an important role, is because we can influence change. And while a lot of the projects that we work on are kind of glitzy and glamour, and there is that component, I think that every one of the projects that we're doing, whether it's a 5-star hotel or a public park, that there are components that we can bring to everyone's attention that are going to make that place more successful in the end.
And to add to that, I completely agree with the question. I think this would also be considered a wicked problem in terms of urban planning terms. And there's also many examples that we've both personally witnessed, like the High Line. It started as a public park project to refurbish like a train track that was in use, but now as an unintended consequence, property values are increasing dramatically in that area, and it's hard to afford for people who are not in that income range. And even where I grew up, Flushing, it's like undergoing a lot of development and gentrification. And, there are actually like projects located right across the street from, 5 new developments that are happening. And I think there's no easy answer for this, but for us is we should do what we can to advocate for people from all different backgrounds. We can design for the interests of our client, but we can also push back when we think that one of the designs or some thing that the client wants will have unintended consequences for the local community, and that's where we can have our voice, because hopefully, the client will be open and willing to listen to what we have to say. But it is a very difficult topic, especially.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah.
I think the second question here, if we want to quickly try to do these in 2 minutes, the third one that came up is really interesting, so I want to get to it too. But how do you apply your third place knowledge to these projects? Is it more conversational with communities? I think the most interesting thing about this is that this is something, third place information is something that we've only really started to look at within the last 1.5 years, right? And I think that through a couple other conferences we've been doing, Global Cities, and other workshops we've been doing, it's really been a term that's come to light, but it's also been a really great way to describe the value that we're finding in places that we may have just described as public space before. So I think that we have not yet done a project where the client's coming to us with information on third places. So it's something that we're bringing up in conversation and looking really to how we can be sure that those are addressed and part of the conversation. So it's something definitely new to us. And I think leading into that to the next one on fourth places, I think that's extremely interesting. I've heard of this. I have not looked into it. It's came up in some of the literature that we've looked at. But I think the ephemeral idea with technology is something that we are exploring in a lot of our work, especially in the Middle East, where technology is like at the forefront of everything, whether it's driverless cars or projection technology or or animation. So I think that a lot of that is working into our work, but I also love the idea here where you're saying an example is protests. And I think that, you know, the one thing that we have forgotten over the years is that a lot of public space in our urban environments was originally programmed for people to have a voice in, right? And it's been also in this last year and a half of COVID that we've also seen those places come back to life, the streets, the urban plazas, through Black Lives Matter protests and through all of these initiatives that people are looking for places to express themselves. And I think that we need to remember that when we're designing open public space, that that's something that still has to happen. That's a major program element that needs to be considered in every environment we're working within.
I guess here's the time, and thank you so much for the incredible talk, Derek and Ivy. We have to end here to accommodate the next Zoom session, but thank you again, and thank you everyone for attending. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
It was great. Have a great rest of your conference, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.